On a quiet stretch of farmland in Ohio at the dawn of the 20th century, there stood a modest two-story farmhouse, white paint peeling, its wooden frame weathered by decades of wind and rain. From the outside, it seemed ordinary, even humble, a place where families might gather for supper after long days in the fields. Yet inside its walls, beneath the creak of its floorboards and the faint smell of damp earth, lay a secret that no one could explain. A basement sealed shut, bricked off so carefully that it seemed less like renovation and more like a burial. It was 1902 when the farmhouse first drew notice, purchased by a young couple eager to escape the growing industrial hum of nearby towns. They imagined a life shaped by the rhythms of the land harvests, seasons, the steady beat of rural existence. But their dreams soured quickly. As they settled into their new home, they noticed details that unsettled them. The odd chill in the back rooms even during summer heat, the way candles flickered in still air, and the basement door at the rear of the kitchen, bolted, bricked, and impenetrable. No one had told them why it was sealed, and the cellar had deflected with vague words, nothing to worry about, just old work. The couple accepted this explanation at first, but soon the silence of that bricked-off space began to gnaw at them. Neighbors whispered. They said the house had been empty for years, though no one could quite remember why. Some recalled a family who had once lived there but left in haste, leaving behind furniture and tools, as if fleeing something they could not face. Others muttered of sounds heard at night, a muffled thud, the scrape of something moving deep, underground, long after the place was abandoned. In a community where superstition still lingered alongside hard labor, the sealed basement became a source of speculation. People wondered not just what was hidden, but why it was hidden so deliberately. The farmhouse itself seemed to resist its new occupants. Doors opened without wind, footsteps creaked on staircases no one climbed, and the bricked wall in the basement loomed larger in their minds than the house itself. One night, the couple thought they heard voices low and urgent rising from the ground beneath them. At first, they dismissed it as imagination, the trick of an old house settling on its foundations. But as the weeks passed, their nerves began to fray. Guests who visited often remarked on the uneasy stillness, how the air grew heavy as evening fell. Some refused to stay the night, leaving quickly once the sun set. The farmhouse was no longer just a home. It had become a question. Curiosity edged into fear, and fear into obsession. Why had the basement been bricked shut with such precision? Why did the walls hum with an almost inaudible resonance when one pressed an ear against the cold stone? And why, above all, did the silence of the farmhouse never feel truly silent? The husband grew restless, pacing at night, staring at the bricked doorway as though it demanded something from him. His wife tried to distract him, to remind him of their farm work, but even she could not escape the weight of the sealed room below their feet. The story of the bricked-off basement reached further across the county. Some scoffed, dismissing it as gossip born of isolation. Others leaned into darker explanations. A preacher declared it a mark of sin, a space deliberately closed to trap what should never have been released. An old woman from the neighboring farm insisted it was punishment, that someone had been entombed down there for crimes too foul to name. These were stories with no proof, yet they spread, carried in hushed tones across church pews and taverns alike. And the couple, caught at the center, could not find answers, only questions that deepened their unease. By autumn, the farmhouse had become a place of tension. Every creak of wood and shift of shadow seemed tied to that bricked wall. It was no longer just a feature of the house. It was the house. What had been intended as a sanctuary had turned into a vessel for dread, and the couple began to wonder if they had been drawn to the farmhouse, not by choice, but by fate. Each day, as the cornfields withered into husks and the sky grew heavy, with the first hints of winter, the farmhouse loomed darker, its secret pressing on them like a weight. Something waited behind those bricks, something old, deliberate, and hidden for reasons no one could or would say aloud. This is the story of the farmhouse with a bricked-off basement, a story where silence was louder than words, where walls spoke in whispers, and where history left its mark, not in books, but in mortar and stone. To enter this story is to enter a puzzle that resists solutions, a mystery not just of place, but of time, fear, and the strange ways humans bury what they cannot confront. And as the couple would soon discover, what is buried does not always stay forgotten. At the turn of the 20th century, Ohio was a state caught between two identities. On the one hand, it was a land of fields, barns, and small rural communities where life moved at the pace of crops and seasons. On the other, it was increasingly shaped by the expanding industrial centers Cleveland, Cincinnati, Akron, whose factories belched smoke into the sky and drew thousands into their orbit. This tension between old and new defined not just the economy, but the daily existence of those who lived there. To understand the farmhouse with the bricked-off basement, one must first understand this landscape and the society that built it. In 1902, the part of Ohio where our farmhouse stood was firmly agricultural. The soil was rich and fertile, producing corn, wheat, and livestock for markets that fed both local towns and the growing cities further east. Families often worked from dawn to dusk, bound by the rhythms of plowing, planting, and harvest. Farmhouses were more than dwellings. They were fortresses of survival, built solid to withstand storms and cold winters. The style was practical. 2 stories, pitched roofs, large kitchens, cellars for storing preserved food and tools. Basements were especially important in these homes, serving as storage spaces, storm shelters, and sometimes root cellars where barrels of apples, potatoes, and onions could last through the winter. But basements also carried another meaning. They were places of secrecy, where items could be hidden, and where, in darker times, darker things might be concealed. In communities marked by both superstition and practical necessity, a bricked-off basement was a deeply unsettling anomaly. To seal off such a space was to erase its function, to remove it from the life of the household. In doing so, it transformed from a practical room into a symbol of fear, of shame, or of something so disturbing that it demanded to be hidden away. Early 1900s in Ohio were also marked by cultural divides. Many rural areas held fast to traditions of faith, especially Protestant denominations, that dominated small-town life. Churches were the backbone of communities, not just spiritually but socially, shaping moral codes and dictating ideas of what was right or wrong. Gossip carried weight, and a reputation could mean the difference between trust and suspicion. A house with a bricked-off basement would not just have been an architectural oddity. It would have been an invitation to speculation, a mark against its inhabitants, whispered about in pews and across fences. Beyond religion and farming, Ohio's rural society carried lingering shadows of the past. The state had been a battleground of thought during the Civil War, and while slavery was long abolished, racial tensions and fears of the unknown persisted. Folk beliefs thrived, often a mixture of old European superstitions and American rural lore. The idea that evil could dwell in a house, or that spirits might haunt the earthbound remains of the wronged, was not dismissed so easily as superstition. In 1902, it was entirely possible for a family to believe that a basement could contain not just objects, but energies, presences, or even punishments left by those who came before. Economically, rural Ohio was not wealthy. Most farm families lived modestly, their survival tied to good harvests and stable markets. Banks and merchants held power, and a bad season could mean ruin. In such a precarious world, homes carried the weight of inheritance and survival. A farm passed down through generations was a source of pride, but also of anxiety. Debts, disputes, and scandals could destroy a family's standing. A house sealed in mystery might be avoided, or worse, quietly condemned by rumor as cursed. The farmhouse in question, with its unusual architecture and strange atmosphere, would have stood out against this backdrop of ordinary hardship. Architecture of the time also tells us much about the mindset. The early 1900s farmhouse often included a basement not just for storage, but as a shelter against tornadoes and harsh winters. To wall off such a useful space would have seemed irrational, unless driven by necessity. Was it structural instability, An accident covered up? Or something? Less material, an attempt to bury history itself. The deliberate act of sealing it away speaks not just of construction, but of intention. And in the cultural climate of Ohio's rural communities, intention was everything. Socially, these were tight-knit yet isolated groups. News traveled slowly, often by word of mouth or through small-town newspapers that focused on births, deaths, and local disputes. Any anomaly like a farmhouse with a hidden room would ripple through the community, feeding speculation. Stories could grow with each retelling, reshaped by fear and imagination. By the time the couple purchased the farmhouse in 1902, its reputation may already have been tarnished, even if the truth of its history was lost. This was the power of oral tradition in rural America. Houses could carry stories like scars, visible even to those who had never stepped inside. We must also consider the scientific and cultural moment of 1902. Psychology was just beginning to enter the American conversation, with new ideas about the mind, memory, and trauma creeping into intellectual circles. But in rural Ohio, most people explained strange occurrences through the lens of faith or folklore. A house that creaked or whispered might be labeled haunted. A sealed basement might be imagined as a tomb, without modern frameworks to explain. Away the unusual, fear filled the vacuum. The unknown was not just curiosity, it was danger. Ohio's culture of silence also played a role. Families often concealed their struggles, preferring to endure rather than expose themselves to public scrutiny. If something terrible had occurred in the farmhouse, a crime, an illness, a death, there was every reason to keep it hidden, to brick it over literally and figuratively. Secrecy was both a shield and a curse. By 1902, the farmhouse carried that secrecy in its very architecture, presenting a facade of normalcy while hiding something darker within. The couple who bought the farmhouse entered not just a home but a history they could not see. They stepped into a landscape where stories lingered in the soil, where communities clung to memory and fear. The sealed basement was not merely an architectural detail, it was a reflection of the world around it, of a culture that buried what it could not face, of a society that balanced on the line between tradition and modernity, and of a time when silence itself was a language, speaking louder than truth. This was Ohio in 1902. Hardworking, devout, bound by land and labor, yet haunted by the things it chose to conceal. The farmhouse sat at the edge of a lonely stretch of road, its white paint peeling, its windows set deep like watchful eyes. For the new owners, a young couple looking for a quiet start in 1902, it seemed modest, ordinary even. But the first signs that the house bore more than creaking timbers appeared within days of their arrival. It began with noises subtle at first, easily dismissed as the house settling. Yet these noises were not random. They came at night, in the hours when silence should have been total. A faint dragging, as though something heavy were being pulled across the basement floor. A hollow thud that echoed not from the rooms they lived in, but from somewhere behind the wall of bricks that sealed off part of the cellar. The husband brought a lantern one evening, determined to trace the sounds. His wife, pale but curious, followed him down the wooden steps. The light fell against the basement walls, revealing stone, earth, and the uneven surface of red brick where one section had clearly been sealed long ago. Dust clung to the edges. Cobwebs thickened the corners, but there was no sign of recent disturbance. Still, as they stood in silence, both swore they heard a low, almost muffled noise, like a groan deep within. They told themselves it was the wind through the cracks in the foundation, yet neither slept well that night. Weeks passed, and small misfortunes began to follow. Tools left in the shed disappeared, only to reappear leaning against the basement door. The family dog refused to enter the cellar, growling and whining whenever it was forced near the entrance. At times, when the couple walked across the floorboards above, they could feel a faint vibration beneath their feet, as though something moved in the space below. The sense of unease deepened into dread. The first undeniable incident occurred, one stormy evening. Rain hammered the roof, thunder rolled across the fields, and the couple took refuge in the parlor. In the chaos of the storm, they heard a loud crack not from above, but from below. Rushing to the cellar, they found that a section of plaster near the bricked wall had crumbled away, exposing part of the mortar. From within, the narrow crack drifted a smell. It was faint, yet revolting. The stench of rot and damp earth mingled with something metallic, like rust or blood. The wife fainted at the threshold, and the husband dragged her back upstairs, shaken. He told her they would not go down again, that the storm had weakened old masonry. Yet both knew it was more than that. Something had stirred behind the bricks. The days that followed, the atmosphere in the house changed. Doors swung open on their own. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls at dusk. At night, they sometimes woke to find the lamps extinguished, even though they were certain they had been left burning. Worse, the noises grew bolder. What had once been faint thuds now became distinct footsteps, deliberate and slow, pacing in the sealed space. At times it was followed by the scrape of nails across stone, or a shuddering sigh that seemed to seep through the cracks themselves. The wife began praying aloud in the evenings, her voice trembling, while her husband tried to occupy himself with work in the fields, though he too felt the weight of the house pressing in. The second major incident came with the discovery of markings. One morning, when the wife descended to retrieve jars from the cellar shelves, she froze. Across the dusty floor leading to the bricked wall were faint lines like trails etched in the dirt. They resembled claw marks, though no animal had been there. They pointed straight toward the sealed section as though something within had dragged itself to the wall, desperate to break through. Terrified, she refused to go down again, forcing her husband to tend to the cellar alone. Even he, stubborn and skeptical, began locking the basement door each night, as though that would keep whatever lay behind the bricks from advancing further. By autumn, their fear grew into obsession. They debated tearing down the bricks, desperate to confront whatever secret was entombed there. But each time they gathered courage, something would intervene. One night, as the husband prepared tools to chip away at the mortar, the lantern flickered violently and went out, plunging them into darkness. From below, the sound of whispering rose, soft at first, then louder, too many voices to count, overlapping, in a language neither recognized. It lasted only moments, but it was enough. They fled upstairs, abandoning the plan, shaken to their core. Neither spoke of it, yet neither could forget. The farmhouse seemed to respond to their fear, feeding on it. The wife's health began to decline. She grew pale, restless, often waking with scratches on her arms as though she had clawed herself in her sleep. The husband, too, became gaunt, distracted, prone to sudden bursts of anger he could not explain. Neighbors began to whisper that the couple had changed, that something was wrong in the house. When asked, the wife would only say the place felt heavy, suffocating. She avoided specifics, fearing ridicule or worse, confirmation of her suspicions. Then came the third incident, the most terrifying yet. Late one night, a scream tore through the farmhouse. The husband rushed to the kitchen where his wife stood frozen, pointing toward the cellar door. The wood was trembling, not from the draft, but as if something pounded from the other side, demanding to be let out. They clutched each other, helpless, as the pounding grew louder, faster, shaking the hinges. Then just as suddenly it stopped. Silence fell, so complete it was deafening. When morning came, the door bore no marks, no damage, nothing to prove what they had heard. Yet they knew it had been real. Fear soon gave way to resignation. They no longer spoke of uncovering the basement. Instead, they avoided it entirely, leaving it sealed as it had been for decades. But the house did not forgive their silence. More strange occurrences followed, objects vanishing, disembodied voices calling their names, shadows standing at the foot of their bed. The wife claimed to see figures in the corners of rooms, blurred and indistinct, watching. The husband confessed that in the fields he sometimes glimpsed someone staring at him from an upstairs window, though the house was locked and empty. The final incident that cemented the house's reputation came one winter night. Snow lay thick on the ground, muffling sound when the couple was awoken by a crash below. Against their better judgment, they descended together, lantern in hand. What they found left them speechless. The bricked wall was cracked, mortar crumbling, as though struck from the inside. A hole no wider than a fist gaped in the center, and from it issued a blast of cold air, thick with the stench of decay. In the dirt below, fresh claw marks stretched outward, reaching into the cellar. Terrified beyond measure, they fled the house that night, never to return. When neighbors investigated days later, they found the farmhouse abandoned, belongings left behind as though the couple had fled in haste. The basement remained sealed, though the cracked section of wall bore undeniable signs of pressure from within. Rumors spread like wildfire that the house was cursed, that the sealed room contained the remains of the murdered, that the couple had been driven mad by spirits. Some claimed they had seen lights in the windows after the house was left empty, or heard voices when passing by at night. Few dared to approach, and those who did never stayed long. The farmhouse became a place of whispered warnings, a landmark of dread in the rural Ohio landscape. Farmers advised their children not to wander near it. Travelers on the lonely road glanced at it nervously, quickening their pace, and still the house stood, silent, its bricked-off basement waiting, holding its secret in the cold earth below. Whatever lay behind those walls remained undisturbed, but the fear it inspired lived on in every story, every cautious glance, every memory of the couple who had tried to make it their home. When the couple abandoned the farmhouse, the disappearance was noticed almost immediately. Neighbors found the doors unlocked, a half-prepared meal left on the kitchen table, and clothes still hanging in wardrobes. For a community as small and interwoven as rural Ohio in 1902, such an abrupt departure was unheard of. Families rarely left without notice, and certainly not in the dead of winter. The absence of farewell or explanation struck everyone as unusual, and soon enough, the rumors began to spread. At first, people speculated that financial hardship or marital strife had driven the couple away. But when word reached the local pastor that claw-like marks had been discovered near the cracked section of the basement, the tone shifted. Some whispered that the couple had stumbled upon something they should never have uncovered, and that their flight was not voluntary but necessary for survival. The pastor, reluctant to feed into superstition, nevertheless admitted to others in confidence that there was a darkness about the house, something that could not be explained by scripture alone. The local doctor was among the few brave enough to step inside after the couple's departure. He described the air as damp and suffocating, heavy with mold and a faint metallic tang. He dismissed talk of spirits, attributing the family's sickness and decline in health to poor ventilation, damp walls, and possible exposure to toxins from decaying material within the bricked-off section. Science explains more than fear ever will, he told the community. Yet when pressed, he could not account for the sounds others claimed to have heard near the house. Nor could he explain why the bricked wall seemed to bulge outward as though pressure had been applied from within. Neighbors held divided opinions. The older generation, steeped in folklore and superstition, leaned heavily toward the supernatural explanation. Tales of restless spirits, of wrongs buried with the dead, were not uncommon in rural communities, and the farmhouse seemed to fit neatly into such beliefs. Younger, more practical farmers, however, saw it differently. They argued that the couple had likely been driven mad by isolation, stress, and the eerie atmosphere of a creaking, decaying home. They reminded others that loneliness and paranoia could twist the mind as effectively as any ghost. The local newspaper eventually caught wind of the story, publishing a short but sensational account. It described the farmhouse as a dwelling of dread, noting the couple's unexplained departure and the strange state of the basement. While the article avoided outright mention of the supernatural, it hinted at unnatural disturbances that had long been whispered of in the region. Such coverage ensured that the farmhouse's reputation spread beyond the village, drawing curious onlookers who wanted to see for themselves the house with the sealed basement. A few dared to enter, but none stayed long. Each described an atmosphere so oppressive that even standing in the parlor felt like trespassing. Religious leaders in the area took different stances. Some saw the farmhouse as evidence of divine punishment, a place cursed by past sins, perhaps even a site of murder buried and hidden behind those bricks. Others framed it as a test of faith, warning their congregations against dabbling in curiosity or seeking to disturb the dead. Sermons were delivered with veiled references to places where the veil between this world and the next is dangerously thin, and congregants left with chills, knowing exactly what was meant without hearing the farmhouse's name spoken aloud. From more a psychological perspective, what struck people most was how quickly the couple had changed after moving in. Friends recalled that the wife had been lively and cheerful when she first arrived, yet became withdrawn and gaunt within months. The husband, once sociable, grew irritable and distant. To some, this transformation was proof that they had encountered something beyond human comprehension. To others, it was the slow unraveling of fragile minds under pressure from the house itself. Scholars who would later study similar cases argued that environments heavy with fear, silence, and mystery can alter behavior, amplifying paranoia until ordinary events take on monstrous significance. Yet even such rational explanations did little to quell the aura surrounding the farmhouse. Over time, the community adopted an uneasy relationship with the property. It was avoided, yet never torn down. Farmers passing by on wagons reported feeling watched as if unseen eyes followed them from behind the cracked windows. Children dared each other to run up to the porch and touch the door, their laughter masking their genuine terror. Stories of lights flickering in the windows or shadows moving across the rooms became common currency at gatherings. The farmhouse turned into a local legend, both feared and cherished as a story to be told on cold nights by firelight. There were even claims, though impossible to verify, that the bricked wall in the basement was older than the farmhouse itself. Some argued that it had been sealed generations before, and the house was simply built atop an existing ruin. Others speculated that the wall was a deliberate concealment, meant to hide a crime too terrible to be spoken of. Such ideas only deepened the sense of dread. The truth remained sealed, hidden behind the bricks, but imagination filled the gaps with horrors far greater than reality might have contained. As years passed, the farmhouse fell further into disrepair. Vines climbed its walls, shutters rotted, and the paint flaked until the house stood gray and skeletal against the fields. Yet the legend did not fade. Newcomers to the area were always warned, told to avoid the house at night, to never step into the basement if they dared enter at all. Some dismissed the tales as superstition, only to find themselves unnerved when they finally saw the place with their own eyes. It was not merely the crumbling wood or the sagging roof that unsettled them. It was the feeling, heavy and suffocating, that lingered in the air. A feeling that the farmhouse itself resented intrusion, that the walls held secrets not meant to be disturbed. The community's reaction was thus a blend of fear, fascination, and resignation. They could not deny what had been witnessed, nor could they fully accept the explanations offered. The farmhouse became a symbol of mysteries unsolved, of the line between sanity and terror, of the shadows that dwell not only in places but in people's minds. It was a reminder that some walls are bricked not merely with mortar and stone, but with silence, secrecy, and fear. And for those who lived near it, the farmhouse was a lesson never to forget. Some doors once closed should never be opened. The winter of 1902 deepened, bringing with it a silence that seemed to magnify every whisper about the farmhouse. Snow blanketed the fields, muffling footsteps, and the old house stood like a monument to dread, its roof sagging under frost. It was during this season that a small group of men, stirred by equal parts fear and curiosity, resolved to confront the mystery once and for all. They were not reckless boys seeking thrills, but hardened farmers, church elders, and townsfolk who had grown weary of shadows ruling their nights. They wanted answers, or at least closure. On a gray January morning, 4 men armed with lanterns, shovels, and the grim determination of those who feel cornered by the unknown entered the farmhouse. The air inside was colder than the wind outside, a stillness heavy with mold and dust. Every creak of the floorboards under their boots echoed as though the house itself were groaning. One man muttered a prayer under his breath. Another gripped the lantern so tightly that the glass shook in its frame. They descended into the basement, where the bricked wall waited like a silent adversary. For years, it had loomed as the source of every tale and nightmare. Now, up close, it seemed almost alive. The mortar was cracked in places, and faint discolorations stained the bricks, as though something had seeped outward long ago. One of the men touched the wall and recoiled instantly, swearing it was unnaturally cold, colder even than the winter air. Another laughed nervously, accusing him of superstition, but his voice trembled. With heavy picks and hammers, they began to strike. Each blow echoed like a drumbeat of defiance against decades of silence. Dust filled the air, coating their lungs, but they pressed on, driven by something deeper than courage, perhaps desperation. The first brick clattered free and rolled across the floor, then another. Soon, a hole yawned open, wide enough to peer inside. The lantern light cut through the dust, illuminating a black void. At first, the space behind the wall seemed to be nothing more than a narrow chamber, roughly hewn and damp. But as the hole widened, the truth began to reveal itself. Within the recess, stacked in unnatural order, were bones, human bones, piled as though discarded, left to rot in darkness. Skulls stared outward with hollow sockets, ribs protruded like warped timbers, and femurs lay tangled like driftwood after a storm. The silence in the basement deepened, broken only by the sound of retching as one of the men staggered back. Another whispered, "God have mercy," his voice trembling with both horror and awe. The stench of decay, faint but undeniable, rose as they disturbed the chamber. It was not the sharp odor of fresh rot, but the earthy, lingering scent of things long hidden. As the lantern light flickered, the shadows seemed to dance across the skeletal remains, animating them into grotesque forms. For the men, the farmhouse had ceased to be a building. It was now a tomb. Their shovels clattered to the floor, abandoned, as if even iron was powerless in the face of what had been uncovered. One of the elders insisted they reseal the wall immediately, that disturbing the dead any further would bring ruin upon them all. But another argued for bringing the sheriff, for alerting the press, for turning the farmhouse into evidence of crimes long buried. The argument grew heated, their voices echoing against the low ceiling, mixing fear with anger. Yet the bones remained silent, their presence louder than any human voice. When the sheriff was finally summoned, his reaction was one of grim disbelief. He stood at the opening, lantern held high, and shook his head slowly. "I can't tell if this is murder or something older than any of us," he muttered. His words only deepened the uncertainty. The sheriff refused to remove the bones, claiming the cold and unstable walls made it unsafe. Instead, he ordered the chamber resealed, a decision that left the community divided. Some believed he wanted to avoid scandal, while others thought he feared something far worse, that the remains belonged to an ancient atrocity, better left untouched. In the weeks that followed, the farmhouse became a site of near religious dread. People spoke of seeing figures in the snow near the property, shadows that vanished when approached, sounds of weeping that carried on the wind. Horses balked when driven near, and dogs howled in the night, their cries rising like a mournful chorus. A sense of something unfinished hung over the land, as though unquiet souls still lingered in protest of their confinement. The men who had broken the wall were never the same. One took to drink, plagued by nightmares of skeletal hands reaching through the darkness. Another left the county entirely, unable to pass the farmhouse without feeling a chill crawl up his spine. The elder who had demanded the wall be resealed became more reclusive, insisting that they had invited a curse by disturbing the chamber. Each carried the burden differently, but all carried it. The legend grew, twisting as it spread. Some claimed the bones were victims of the farmhouse's original builders, sacrificed in a pact for fertile land. Others said the bricked wall had been erected by settlers who feared an epidemic and walled off the infected alive. More imaginative tales spoke of cults, of rituals carried out in the name of nameless gods. No single version prevailed, but all agreed on one point. The farmhouse was no longer just haunted by whispers. It had been touched by revelation, and that revelation was worse than any ghost. The climax of the farmhouse's story was not in the discovery of the bones alone, but in what they meant for those who lived nearby. For the people of that rural Ohio community, the bricked-off basement had transformed from mystery into proof that some darknesses do not fade with time. They persist, waiting for curious hands to tear down the walls that contain them. And when those walls crumble, the silence that escapes is louder than any scream. When spring finally came to the Ohio countryside, melting the frost and sending rivers of thawed snow across the farmland, the farmhouse stood unchanged. Its windows, clouded with grime, reflected the pale sky like blind eyes. For the people of the community, the season brought no relief, for the secret within its bricked basement had already taken root in their imaginations. What they had uncovered was not merely bones, it was a fracture in the trust between the living and the soil that sustained them. The land itself no longer felt safe. Neighbors avoided the path that cut near the farmhouse. Children who once dared each other to run up the porch steps refused to approach it, swearing they could hear whispers rising from the basement vent when the wind blew at dusk. Farmers working their fields looked up from their plows, only to see the house looming on, the horizon like a sentinel, its presence growing heavier with each passing day. To them, the farmhouse was no longer an abandoned structure. It had become a shadow over their lives, a reminder that time does not erase everything, it buries some truths deeper. The sheriff's decision to reseal the wall, rather than investigate, further became a source of quiet resentment. Families wondered what he feared, or perhaps what he already knew. Rumors swirled of his late-night visits to the farmhouse, where a lantern's glow could sometimes be seen moving slowly from room to room. Some swore he prayed in the basement before the wall, as though bargaining with something no one else dared to name. Others believed he was simply ensuring no one returned to break it open again. Whatever the truth, the sheriff's silence only thickened the fog of mystery. Over the years, attempts were made to sell the farmhouse, but no one would stay. Families who moved in lasted weeks at most, claiming they heard footsteps pacing above them at night or saw muddy handprints appear on the inside of cellar doors. One couple left their belongings behind entirely, walking away without explanation. Their neighbors, when questioned, simply said they looked as though they had seen something that broke them. The farmhouse would not hold residents, as though it rejected the living. Historians, decades later, would argue over the meaning of the bones. Some suggested they were remnants of frontier violence, casualties of skirmishes between settlers and displaced peoples whose presence had been wiped from the official record. Others posited that disease had swept through a family and their bodies were sealed away in a desperate act of containment. But there were details that resisted explanation. The orderly stacking of the bones, the way certain skulls appeared to have been fractured deliberately, the stains on the brick that seemed more like ritual than accident. These details invited interpretations that leaned away from history and toward folklore. By the mid-20th century, the farmhouse had already entered the realm of legend. Children in nearby towns whispered of the house with the wall of bones, inventing tales of curses that passed to anyone who dared touch its doors. Teenagers drove out on summer nights, their cars parked in the fields, headlights cutting across the rotting frame. Some claimed to see figures moving through the windows, though no one was ever inside. Local papers occasionally ran stories about the site, always with the same photograph. The sagging roofline framed against a cloudy sky, a relic of decay that would not collapse. Even today, the farmhouse endures. Stripped of furniture, weathered by storms, it leans but does not fall. The bricked wall remains untouched beneath the earth, its secret sealed once again. Yet those who live nearby still speak of the house in low tones, reluctant to call its name aloud after dark. Some say the basement grows colder every year, the frost lingering longest around its foundation, as if winter itself clings to the stones. Others claim that animals still avoid the place, circling wide in the fields rather than crossing its shadow. There are those who insist the farmhouse is not cursed, but simply misunderstood, a repository of history too complex to unravel. Perhaps the bones are evidence of some long-forgotten tragedy, a plague, a massacre, or a family's misfortune. Yet even these rational voices cannot explain the unease that lingers, the instinct that warns visitors to turn back once they step onto the porch. The silence inside is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of being watched. What remains is a question with no answer. Are the dead within the wall at rest, or are they waiting? Waiting for justice, for remembrance, or perhaps for the wall to fall again? And if it does, what will emerge? The thought is enough to keep the bricked-off basement sealed, not by mortar, but by fear. For the greatest walls are not those built of brick. They are those built in the mind, the barriers we refuse to cross because we fear what waits on the other side. In the end, the farmhouse does not need to reveal its truth. Its power lies in the uncertainty, in the quiet dread it instills simply by existing. It stands as a reminder that history is not always written in books or recorded in archives. Sometimes it lies buried in basements, bricked away by hands that chose secrecy over revelation. And when those walls are finally disturbed, the echoes ripple outward, touching every life within reach. Perhaps that is the lesson of the farmhouse, that some pasts, no matter how deeply hidden, will always find a way to haunt the present.